Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Now, some would argue that humans have evolved enough to value reason more than emotions. But this idea doesn't seem to be true when we see the workings of mob mentality, often guided by blind passion or even fear of isolation. People agree to ideas and actions just because that's what the majority says. So why do individuals feel the pressure to conform to majority opinion, even when they know that these opinions might be wrong? And how strong is the social pressure of having to conform? We explore this topic today in more detail on tonight's show. And joining us for this discussion is Professor John Drury, who is a professor of social psychology at Sussex University, joining us from London. We're also joined by Mr. Arturo Garcia, who's a political analyst, joining us from Germany. We're also joined by Dr. Valerio Bruno, who's a political analyst, joining us from Switzerland. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor John Drury, let me begin with you. Tell us, how powerful is mob mentality or group thinking when we talk about the social setup?
Well, first of all, I'd like to challenge the term you're using, mob mentality. It's a way to denigrate crowds. If you look at the history of social change, you find collectives are nearly always involved. And it's those in power who use terms like mob mentality to delegitimize opposition. So you might say, why is it that people are sometimes more extreme in their behavior collectively than they are alone? And the problem is to reduce that to a question of psychology, because there are plenty of ideologies out there, some of which are reactionary, some of which are destructive. And the difference that being in a crowd makes is not that it changes the mentality to be more stupid, but more that it gives people more power to enact their ideology.
Yeah. So, but even in the cases where there is violence being inflicted on minority members, let's say, let's talk about the lynchings that are carried out in India this year under the Modi government, where we saw people going after those who were involved in cow meat eating. In that case, too, would you say that mob mentality isn't a term that should be applied?
Yes, it's an incorrect term. Let me give you an example from the UK. A few years ago, there was a campaign run by a newspaper to publicly reveal the names of people who were convicted paedophiles. Now, when local communities heard about this, they gathered in groups and they picketed outside people's homes and they threatened them and behaved in other threatening and potentially violent ways. And the newspapers then said this was mob mentality. But in fact, what was going on was not that people were unable to process, unable to understand what was happening and behaving in a stupid way. They simply didn't trust the authorities, were taking the law into their own hands and enacting beliefs that they already had about the threat of paedophiles. So the problem wasn't the crowd. The problem was the ideology of punishing people who'd already been to prison for apparently being paedophiles.
Yeah. All right. I take your point there. And let's further elaborate and discuss this idea that you're talking about, which is of a collective action or collective measures taken because your ideology guides you towards that action. Dr. Valerio, when we're talking about this and in the political scenario, we often hear about how hate is on the rise, whether it's from Islamophobic attacks or anti-Semitism. And a lot of this is attributed to the political climate where right-wing politicians use this to fuel their campaigns. But as Professor John Drury was talking about, that these are just ideologies that are emboldened in a way. Do you think that the violence we witness today is in fact just people being emboldened, their inner sentiments just being emboldened?
Well, I agree with the professor. There is for sure a component related to ideology. But today, as regards, I would say especially, let's say, Western countries, there is also very strong component related to frustration, to economic malaise, And populist parties, especially radical right parties, they use it in a sense to polarize politics, especially using, as I said, frustration and fear. It's also striking that if you regard the way populists they address to citizens, they call them the people. They don't call them citizens. And this is very important because in this way they don't differentiate. And politically, it's very relevant today. This problem of using fear and frustration as triggers to mobilize masses and crowds.
Yeah. And Mr. Garcia, please tell us, well, we're talking about how the fear and frustration is capitalized by politicians all over the world. Tell us about certain mediums that make this capitalization more effective. For instance, social media. How is that being used to gather certain sentiments and heighten them?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. And I'm glad that you asked me because my PhD research takes on the subject of controls over the executive that are being enforced without the boundaries of a parliament. So one of those controls are the media, the establishment media, and like you said, the social media nowadays, most recently through internet. But I will have to disagree a little bit with my colleagues in regard of the populist movement. They actually, of course, they use these mobs as a legitimation tool, but also the establishment, the political establishment uses the media and the social media also to impose a certain boundary of political discussion, whereas just within this boundary is an argument accepted or a political opinion accepted. I do agree that a feeling of belonging is just natural and to some degree probably necessary to bound cultural groups or societies together. And certainly nations are built of a great quantity of this collective thinking, of herd instinct maybe. And it's nothing wrong with that, but until it becomes more important, this herd instinct, as to carry on discussions, as to acknowledge new knowledge. And this standardization is what the establishment seeks. Very strong in relationship to the media. For example, in Germany, you have two big monopolies of the press media. One is the Bertelsmann Group, and the other is the Axel Springer Group, and they own about, I don't know, maybe 16%. Alone, the Axel Springer had almost like 150 newspapers in 30 countries in Europe, and that's a pretty more liberal approach to the discussion. And everything that it's outside this approach is related. It's to be disregarded as a extremist thinking, as a non carrying on to the values of this democratic and liberal society. So I think this herd instinct and this belonging feeling is also a tool that the establishment recognizes and uses to bound the political discussion. That's certainly what's going on in Germany and probably most of West Europe.
Yeah, and following from that statement that you made here, Professor John Drury, going back to you, this herd instinct that Mr. Garcia was talking about here, why do you think that people feel comfort in agreeing with the majority? What are some of the psychological reasons behind that?
Well, again, the term herd instinct is a kind of throwback to a discredited, antiquated psychology that is no longer used. Linking human psychology with animal psychology is not a useful way of talking. We have identities. We have personal identities. We have social identities. And in certain social contexts, our shared identity with other people becomes more salient to us and is used as a way of judging reality and of judging how to behave. So why do people act as one? Because they define themselves as a group member. Why do people conform? Because other people's conduct is judged in that context as a useful guide to behaviour. There's a kind of underlying implication in your questioning that the crowd is and the collective is more simple, its emotionality is more basic than the individual. And I suppose one of the reasons people often think that, they think of crowds and their emotions, and they say, well, crowds are more emotional than the individual, they seem to be less controlled. Why is it that crowds are more emotional than individuals? Why do we become more exuberant in crowds than we are alone?
All right, so Professor, here, I take your point there that you're saying that one shouldn't underestimate the power of how a crowd's emotions are, how complex they are. They're coming from many different facets, many different ideologies are combining for something to result. The reason why that I'm talking about it in this way is that we often hear, in layman's terms, and how people often perceive it to be, that especially when we're talking about violence, that an individual might not have committed such an act, but when being a part of a crowd, they commit a very heinous act that they would have never expected to have. So in that case specifically, how would you shed light on this?
Well, exactly. So, as I was saying at the beginning, the crowd empowers. These people who commit these heinous acts are not people who have changed their ideas, they've changed their power. And going back to the point about emotion, the crowd, if everybody is the same as yourself, right, it validates the emotions, the feelings you already have. It doesn't change us into barbarians. It enables us to enact beliefs that we wouldn't ordinarily have. Like these beliefs around the illegitimacy and the acceptability of committing violence exist in these individuals anyway, and the crowd enables that.
Yeah. And Professor John Drury, I've noted down your point here. And Dr. Bruno, talking about all of this, and you heard the professor talk about how the crowd is in fact just heightening certain emotions that exist already. But what do you see the dangers of that being, especially in the political realm?
Well, for sure, you have on one side, we're talking about masses, about crowds, but you also need the leaders, you know, that they are enabling crowds to mobilize, to being able to channel their frustration, their fear. So this is also important, this component, how masses are able to identify themselves within our leaders. And so these are very important components. Sometimes we tend to believe that the leaders has the same cultural and education of the masses, but in many cases their leaders quite different from the masses. They just try to be perceived, are very similar to the crowd, but indeed they are not. It's a way to instrumentally use masses being perceived as similar, but indeed it's not like that. It's just strategically using them, and this is very important. As I said earlier, as regards populist movements today in countries like, I don't know, Italy or US, for example, when you have leaders like Trump and Salvini, that apparently they can be regarded as quite naive or ignorant, but indeed I think it's not so. It's more artificial stupidity. It's more constructed than natural.
Right.
They're very good at using masses in this regard.
Right. And with that, Mr. Garcia, I'd like your take on this. What do you think are the dangers of collective thinking, especially in the political climate, which kind of banks on people just thinking and following a certain ideology so that it benefits politicians and political leaders?
Yeah, I totally agree with the two commentators, especially with Professor of England, who says that emotions are there, and it's just the crowd that enables these emotions to take form, to take practice on the camp. And it's also very interesting that the relationship between the leader and the crowd, it should be further analysis. There's very little time here to go deep into it. But I would like to just complete the notion of this crowd being a danger in the political spectrum by saying that indeed it becomes a danger because of the big changes, the revolutions indeed of history, through human history, are not carried just by individuals in form of leaders, but the people that back up these leaders as crowds. And indeed we cannot accept to conceptualize all these social phenomena with natural related concepts like the herd instinct that would be social Darwinism, but indeed the dangers within lay in the form of social change, and I mean dangers for the establishment, for the political establishment, as you said, the politicians. And I think one of those dangers expresses itself. This fear of the political establishment expresses itself very clearly. For example, on the German Constitution, we have this Ewigkeitsklausel, that says something like eternity clausel, and it says in the Article 79 that to change this constitution, this form of republic and welfare state and federal bound is impossible. As to say, it's eternal. This establishment, this thinking, this end of history, as Fukushima said, the end of history. So I think that's more dangerous as a popular leader getting some crown around him, very popular support. I think that the establishment, the uses of the establishment, is more dangerous than any other.
And I take your point there, Garcia, but I want to go back to Professor Dury and talk a little about shared identity. And you talked about individual identity and shared identity. What do you think are some of the changes that in modern society have brought about in the relation between an individual and shared identity? Do you think there are any evident changes?
Well, I suppose in the last 20 years, there's been, at least in the West, there's been a greater individualism. I mean, years ago, there was a collectivism, and class was a stronger identity, and so on. I guess, though, I'd like to, before I say any more about that, I'd like to come back to one of the points made earlier about leadership, because the colleague made a very important point when he said, those leaders who try to manipulate crowds, they do so by pretending they're in group. They do so by pretending they have the same shared identity as the rest of the crowd. It makes the point really strongly that, we have this idea that leaders have charisma and they have these personal qualities, and through these personal qualities they can manipulate and shape the crowd to do just anything. But it's not true. They can only influence the crowd to the extent that they can present themselves as having the same identity as the rest of the crowd. And that is why people like Trump and Farage work so hard to present themselves as man of the people. So it just makes a point. Identity is the mechanism and the mediator for collective behavior.
So Professor, would you say that relatability is one of the strongest qualities that politicians need in this modern age to be successful and to gather votes and gather support?
Well, I suppose relatability is a kind of everyday way of talking about shared identity. The leader has to present themselves as one of us. Yeah, I mean, if they're too different from the people they're trying to appeal to, then they won't get that appeal.
Yeah, and going back to the question that we were talking about, could you elaborate on that? How do you think individualism has started gaining more power in modern history?
Well, I'd say it's actually political, because in the West, politicians broke up working class communities. All right, so how do we see ourselves as a group in everyday life? We have structures that address us as group members, like trade unions, the way we work, the way we live our lives in the West now is very individualized. And so, in a way, things like, right, and other, group identities are more attractive because they can give us things that we don't have as individuals, like solidarity. It's very isolating and atomizing to be addressed as an individual all the time. Where's the social support? Groups are attractive because they are sources of social support.
Right. And with that, Dr. Bruno, we were talking about shared identity and how a sense of belonging is often needed, and also how political figures can only appeal to the masses when they seem to be a part of that group. How important is shared identity when we talk about nationalism and the broader community of the nation?
Well, for sure, this is very, very important. It's normal that you must be to some kind of identity, either cultural, national, ethnic, and so this is key. And I think there's been an important revolution in the last decades with the use of internet and social media, because in this way it's very, very easy to channel, to appeal to your, let's say, followers on the internet. If we give a look at the use that people like Trump or Salvini or this kind of leaders, they make of internet and social media, they will understand it's very, very important. And also I wanted to say a point. I agree with Professor Drury. And I will also say we have this prejudice that masses and crowds, it's not easy to forecast their behaviors. I will say it's the opposite. It's more complicated to understand the behavior of the human being as an individual than the masses, the crowd. Probably because, when they gather together, also it's easier that they become emotionally or irrational. So I would say they're more easy, understandable.
Doctor, just here, did you say that when they gather together, they become emotionally irrational? Did I hear you correctly on that point?
Yes. I would say.
So wouldn't that?
I don't want to generalize. Yeah,
so
but
wouldn't that cause more unpredictability?
Yeah, for example, I would say if you take the example of the stadium, the football stadium, and you have this crowd and masses mentality, that it's easier to understand. While if you have individuals, they are always more unpredictable. If you have a single person, it's always more unpredictable that when a lot of people, they gather together, which I understand can look like a paradox, but masses, they are more understandable, according to my opinion.
Yeah. And Mr. Garcia, do you also agree with the point that Dr. Bruno was making here, that when masses come together, they become more unpredictable?
Is it surely more difficult to control? Indeed, I mean, the resources that I've put together to keep a crowd or big masses under a certain parameter are to be bigger as to go directly to the individual. And I share the view that the crowds suffer from this prejudice of being catalogated as erratic and emotional, and you can see that clearly on the subject of for example, direct democracy. It is long argued against direct democracy that the masses, that the mob are ignorant and they won't take the right choices given the chance of, and it related itself of this thinking of the political class as an elite, a enlightened elite that could take better decisions than the mob, a point that I completely disagree, of course, but it certainly lacks a proper argument.
Right. And Professor Drury, just a last argument to you. We were talking about individualism, and we also hear about how identity is becoming more fluid in the modern age. Now, with several aspects competing with one another, people ascribing different parts to their identity, do you think this creates more confusion for the individual person?
No, I think it's a quality of human nature to have multiple identities. And people talk about identity politics these days, but people have always had multiple identities because we have the capacity to think about ourselves in different ways and have different relationships. All these different relationships, different group memberships that we have are all bases for different identities. So it's not a new and confusing thing, because we've always had that capacity to have different identities, to be a father, to be a lecturer, to be a Manchester United supporter in different contexts. Each of those identities having different norms. We had the football example. Well, why is it that some people become more extreme, more aggressive, more emotional at a football game? Well, those are the people that already identify as football supporters, so not anybody will be influenced. And when they are influenced, how do they behave? They behave in line with their group norms, which means rules for conduct. So even the most extreme examples normally have social rules attached to them. And all the crowds in history, you can look at their behaviour and you can find social rules, from the food riots to the French Revolution and so on.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Arturo Garcia, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Valerio Bruno, for joining us. It was lovely talking to you, gentlemen. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us.